IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya Parekh, and today I have with me Pranay Kotasthane. Welcome, Pranay.
Hi.
So before we begin, I'd just like to mention that admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate programs in public policy. So the cohorts begin 1st September 2021, and the deadline for the application is 28th August 2021. To know more, visit takshashila.org.in/courses. So for today's episode, defense production, indigenization, R&D, these are all hot topics in India today, especially so when our main geopolitical rival, China, is emerging as a military superpower able to design and manufacture cutting-edge technologies like Catawba-configured supercarriers, stealth fighters like the J-20 and FC-31, much more before China's rise. However, the United States emerged as the hegemon in the world with its Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency, DARPA. It was the progenitor of many technologies which trickled down from the defense space to the civilian space. And arguably, they've transformed the world for good. For example, the internet evolved from DARPA's ARPANET. So in recent years, we've seen several countries, including India, strive to duplicate DARPA and its success in their own respective systems. Today's episode is dedicated to discussing that in India's case. Is this endeavor possible or not? So my first question to start off the discussion, Pranay, is what is DARPA and how did it become arguably the most successful entity in the international defense and high-tech R&D space?
Yeah, thanks, Aditya. Yeah, I think your introduction sums it all up really nicely. But just to give a background of some of the things which might be less known, right? So first and foremost, DARPA's history begins with the Sputnik program, which was launched by Russia, right? So that was the background, and that was the lesson that the US took, that it should never lag in technological advancements. And that's why the then President Eisenhower started this DARPA, and it was known as ARPA, whatever. And then that project, that agency was specially staffed, given special authorities. Its staffing is very different from conventional government departments, etc. And this agency was specially established in order to stay ahead of the technological curve. And as you rightly mentioned, the internet, miniaturization of GPS receivers, automated voice recognition and translation, even the recent Moderna mRNA vaccines, which have been saving the world, sort of come from DARPA grants, right? So there is a lot of involvement of DARPA in many dual use and even purely civilian technologies. And there are many interesting things as well, like the legend goes how DARPA operates very unconventionally, and then the first cross-country computer network, which they started in 1965, the meeting which sort of gave an approval for $1 million to approve this lasted just 15 minutes. So it's in the sense, the idea that they were trying to say is how anti-bureaucracy setup that DARPA has. So that was sort of a short history of DARPA. Now let's going back to what you mentioned about how did it become the most successful entity, right? So just let's discuss that. First of all, I think the definition of success in this context itself is quite different. For a conventional project, you would define success as how much money have you put and how many great projects have you got in return, right? But for something like DARPA, which was set up to think 10, 20, 30 years in advance, most of its initiatives fail, and that is by design. Had most initiatives been marketable, it would have just meant that the agency wasn't betting on the groundbreaking ideas, right? So success is counterintuitively also should take into account how many projects got discarded because they were probably too ambitious. right? Secondly, one thing we have to remember in terms of success is that many of its projects require long gestation periods. I began with the ARPANET thing, which was in 1965, and internet took maybe 2.5 more decades after that in order to even make a realistic beginning across the world, right? So in that sense, there are challenges to using the word success itself, right? We have to think of it in a very different manner. Now let's so any country which is trying to have DARPA replicas needs to know this upfront, right? That one, most of the projects will fail, and they should fail most of the time if you are really aiming for moonshot ideas. And second, they should also be prepared for long periods of zero successes, right? So that is sort of a background on what success in this context means. Now let me turn to some of the factors that I think have played a role. And I did some reading on a bunch of things related to DARPA, and as you know, it's sort of a legend, so we don't know how much of it, which of these factors played what kind of role. But broadly we can think of four factors that can be attributed some of this success to. So one is an anti-bureaucracy setup, like I told you. First of all, DARPA is very focused on building things, so it is not basic research but products which can be brought out into the market. Second, most important thing is DARPA is not an agency which does things by itself, right? It is only an agency which funds some of these projects, and these projects can be across government, academia, private companies, etc., right? So it is not an agency like DRDO or other things in India where it is a government entity building things. It's not that, right? It is just funding projects outside its own department. Contracting is the main work that it does, and it is a very small organization. It just has around 220 government employees, and out of which 100 are program managers. And these program managers are the key fulcrum of DARPA. They are the ones who basically scout for ideas across industry, academia, government. They are the ones who chase the people for converting these ideas into products, and they are the ones who manage that entire programs, right? So that's why their role is important. And remember, these are not people who stay in government forever. The DARPA structure is unique in the sense program managers just work for really short stints, 3 to 5 years, execute a program, and then they just go out, right? So the incentives for these kind of program managers are very different from what you would have conventionally in a normal government organization across the world, right? So that is one main idea that I thought is relevant. Second one is freedom to try and fail. I think this often means that there is less ministerial oversight, and more crucially, there is common consensus. More than ministerial oversight, I think that is not that big a concern. But there can be ministerial oversight and yet excellent performance. But I think the main idea is that there is a common consensus amongst political actors about what that agency should do for a long time, and that it should be given a long rope. So as long as you have that confidence across the political aisle, then you have freedom to try and fail. And as I already mentioned, that their staffing authority is very different from other government bodies, etc. So that also gives it a freedom to try new things and often fail at them as well. The third important factor is that it has an assured customer from within the government. So as we know, DARPA's main customer is the Department of Defense, right? So that is really important, because some of these products have, and startups which might be trying new things, have some assurance that there will be a customer who can convert their product, place huge orders. So that really helps. In fact, some of US's own DARPA copies now, they have one for homeland security, one for intelligence, one for energy, one for health. They haven't been as successful as DARPA itself. That again because the customer end of those agencies is not that strong as it is for DARPA. Okay. Now, the fourth and final point I would say, and this is less talked about, I think the role of a technologically superior adversary was really important for DARPA to get set up the way it did, right? So it was given all these freedoms, made very different from a government outfit because of the threat that USSR posed. So the moment in history where this was posed as an ideological battle between US and USSR, between two economic and two political systems, was very important for DARPA to get established the way it did, right? And that narrative aspect was also important to get scientists on board for dual use inventions. Many times, scientists would also keep away from things which are related to warfare and military, etc. But that particular moment of history, when which was posed as a big ideological battle, the Cold War, etc., also drove in a lot of things in DARPA's favor. So that, and remember, that was a time of strategic focus. The American government, really went behind the aerospace and electronics. You also had France at that time, which was so nervous about its own electricity supply, and that's why they made winners out of what can be done on nuclear power, right? So that was the moment in which superior adversaries and technologically superior adversaries laid the ground for establishment of these different kinds of government agencies. So these are the 4 points I would say. What do you think, Aditya? Are there any other factors in your mind?
Yeah, Pranay, I'm glad you asked. I think there are at least two things that I'd like to add. First of all, I agree with your point about R&D being inherently, affair wrought with a lot of unsuccessful attempts at achieving their goal is something that Indian policymakers really have to understand because I remember it's been cited by the US government itself that about 80 to 85% of DARPA's undertaken projects fail, as you rightly pointed out. So, I mean, such a high failure rate is something that to any organization who engages in a similar mandate would have to take for granted that this is going to happen and we're going to have to plan for it. And the policy would have to reflect it that you just have to bear the costs for those failures as well. And the second thing I'd like to add is that the US also had this, I don't know, unfair advantage right after World War II that because of Operation Paperclip, they had access to Nazi Germany's former scientists. So I think that did at the time give them some sort of an unfair advantage. So in any case, we can't really apply their model 1:1 here in this
but
era.
I would say, I think, Aditya, one lesson from that is the fact that US, even after that, right, since the last 70 years, over the last 70 years, it has still kept its borders open for technology, immigration of people in high tech areas. And I think that has been a really critical factor, like you mentioned. So even though at that point of time, like you said, there was the post World War II situation, but even if you go 20, 30 years down the line, and even now, like we see, most of AI research, for example, is more than half of all top AI papers are produced by people who are not from the country where they are working, right? So it is all a lot of immigration which helps. So that, I think, US has still sustained, and that is it's not, I wouldn't call it an unfair advantage. I think they deserve that advantage because they have kept that their industry open to participation and allowed people from other countries to also come there and make a life there.
True. I agree with that point. Okay, so moving on, in our newsletter focused on high tech geopolitics, Technopolitik, its second edition. In it, we addressed how countries like Japan, UK, and Germany are taking a stab at building an organization comparable to the original DARPA. Yet nobody apparently has until yet come close. So, from an Indian national perspective, how do you see this?
Yeah, so you're right. No, once there is a success which comes about, then lots of countries over the years have tried their own versions of DAPA, and there are many issues, mainly at the intersection of the 4 points that I spoke about. So let me talk about, from an Indian perspective, about the four factors that maybe had a role in DARPA's success. So factors 2 and 3, which I mentioned, were: one, freedom to try and fail, And the third one, which I had mentioned, was an assured customer from within the government. I think these two are not difficult for India to manage. So, in fact, there is precedence for India's national security agencies being left out of political and electoral fights as such, right? And even, in fact, even the intelligence agencies currently are left out of parliamentary oversight. Not a lot of financial auditing, and in the budget that doesn't reflect. But even I would say, even if we have a lot of parliamentary oversight and financial audit, it is not difficult for political parties to agree on something which is so foundational. And I am sure Indian politicians can forge that understanding. It has happened in the nuclear weapons factor as well. So I think we can have that in DARPA as well. So that's not a problem. The third one, which is an assured customer from within the government, I think that is not been done yet. But I think, again, it's achievable given that we have a lot of defense requirements. So there can be a customer assurance from coming from MOD. We need to change a lot of mindset, but it is still possible. But what I think is really difficult to do is the point number one, to build an anti-bureaucracy or an anti-government setup, right, in a sense. So it is a government entity which is anti-government in the way it is structured, not in its objective, right? So in that sense, to create that kind of a setup that pursues excellence requires immense amount of state capacity, and that I think still governments lack. The third point maybe people would make is that Indian governments will have much less money than US governments would have. And this is where the conversation stops whenever we say about something like DAPA for India. But I don't think that's necessarily a barrier. It only means that it shouldn't mean that the Indian government should take fewer risks. It only means that the areas that Indian government chooses to focus on will be slightly different from the ones that US does. So, for example, maybe Indian defense would focus a lot, a DARPA like agency in India would focus a lot on maybe clean water at high altitudes, or maybe eradicating malaria completely, things like that, which are more relevant in the Indian context and may not require the same kind of money that the challenges that current DARPA in the US is facing, right? So I think the idea is to focus on comparative advantages and comparative needs as well. The fourth point that I had mentioned was a technologically superior adversary. And I think that is one thing which has changed only recently. So India's revealed preference in terms of our deployment, in terms of our collective imagination as a society, shows that Pakistan until now was India's most significant adversary, right? And managing such an adversary didn't require cutting edge technology. India was superior power on most measures of power until now. So I don't think there was that immediate need or that drove India towards looking for more and more technologically superior measures. But it's just now that we are seeing it is changing, and we have a much stronger and advanced adversary, and it is collectively being imagined as such. So I think that gives India a moment to comes out strong on all fronts. It requires India to be strong on technology as well. And that is why I think now is the time when we have the impetus for India to have something like an agency like DARPA, which we have to suit towards Indian needs. What do you think about this?
Indeed, but I'd like to mention that even in the US and the former Soviet Union, people aren't really of the consensus that the Cold War was a good thing, and that the ideologically supported competition between the two superpowers was something that was ultimately good for the people. So, as a proportionate response kind of a mindset, can we do the same with China? I mean, we don't have to match it step for step. Innovation for innovation, development for development. We just have to balance China in a way where we bear conventional, credible deterrence. Although credible deterrence is most of the times used for nuclear forces, here I'm trying to say that when we talk about defense technology, we just have to make sure that we have the technologies to safeguard our interest against China, not exactly compete against it. Because it's a really different ballpark when you think competitively. And I don't really see India having the resources even several decades from now where China would be our equal. So I think a proportionate response, even in R&D, would be something that we should hope for. Not exactly, leapfrog to something that we don't have the resources for or the projected resources for.
Yeah, so I will address this problem, right? So first, what you mentioned about what were the effects of the Cold War era thinking and all that. So I have no doubt, yeah, that there were a lot of negative consequences as well, right? But I'm not talking currently of a normative aspect about what should be done or what happened, but the fact that it happened in history is it's not a normative point, right? It happened. The DARPA was given these kinds of liberties because of the historical currents of that particular moment. So from that perspective, what I'm saying is even now the impetus. See, remember, India's as many developmental needs. There are many claims on the exchequer. So obviously, the defense will not probably have the kinds of resources that you would always want. That is fine. That is the challenge that all governments face. So that will still stay. But the idea that now you have to do something on the technological front is more than what it was 10-15 years ago, just because your adversary has main adversary in your collective imagination in terms of how the government thinks has changed, right? So that is what I'm saying. Second point, what you rightly mentioned, it's not about competing China penny for penny for military equipment for equipment, but even for having the credible deterrence that you mentioned, we will have to do things asymmetrically. We'll have to do things which China isn't expecting India to do. And even to do that kind of work, you would need an agency which takes asymmetric bets, which takes bets which are bound to fail. So, as I said, it might not require a humongous amount of resources. Maybe we will look at different kinds of equipments to balance China rather than building things that US is doing, right? So obviously the instruments we'll use will be different, but to have an agency which thinks asymmetrically, for that we still need something which drives home the imperative that you have to challenge China, even if it is asymmetrically. So that's how I feel. What would you say to that?
Well, I agree with you, honestly. I don't really have a point to refute there.
Sure. Okay. So let's move on with the Indian defense R&D space. So I have a question to ask you, Aditya. Now we often talk about the Indian defense R&D scene, and it is a lot of it is government agencies, right? So we talk about DRDO, and there have been lots of calls for rebuilding those institutions or even dismantling them. So what's your take on this? Why do you think the defense R&D scene has been less than stellar?
I'd be glad to answer that, Pranay. So recently I read this paper by Lieutenant Colonel Vivek Gopal. He published this paper with ORF. It's titled The Case for Nurturing Military Scientists in the Indian Army. But don't be fooled by the title. It's actually talking a lot more about how DARPA is set up and how India can learn from it and what policy recommendations can be made for replicating its success in India's defense R&D space. So I would honestly say that to a lot of the suggestions here in this paper and other papers that I've read around the subject are basically talking about things that we've already implemented in terms of engaging with, say, institutions of higher education in the field of STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, and civilian agencies, etc. So now, while I agree that India only very recently started to giving the private sector a bit of space in defense R&D and manufacturing, sourcing components was something that was actually going on, but it was on a compartmentalized basis. So I think the recommendations that all of this literature makes is something semantic, in the sense that we've already argued these things, but they've presented it cohesively as a strategy. So as intellectuals, we have a lot of stuff there. But when you narrow it down to what exactly is wrong with our system, why hasn't it been able to give you the results that you wanted? I think the fault, as we previously discussed, lies with the fact that we are not really expecting the right kind of outcomes. So the 80 to 85% failure rate is not something that I see any Indian policymaker taking as acceptable. You pitch this to anybody in the government, they're going to say, this is unacceptable, boss. You're going to have to show me a much better result. But I don't think that's just logistically possible to do. That's the main thing. And secondly, I think, say, for example,
But Parik,
Mhm.
Aditya, so I want to sort of interject here. But
Okay.
I mean, in a funny way, a lot of these programs, which are even not technologically, ground beating or moonshot ideas, they still failed, right? So, I mean, they haven't been as successful as you would want, and still the political setup has accepted it, right? So we have had Tejas being going on for 3 decades. We've had so many of these projects which actually went for long and they still continue. So don't you think it reflects the idea that there is a chance for absorption of failures in the Indian setup as well?
Yeah, absorption of failures where there shouldn't be the leeway for failures, and where there should be, there aren't. I get that point. It's reversed in India's case.
Hmm.
But I think still developing an aircraft and developing its power plant is something that, in Tejas's case, for example, is something that really takes decades. And because of Operation Paperclip, the
Hmm.
West had an edge there in that time, and their scientific tradition, their R&D tradition benefited a lot. It's a lot about processes and a proper structure for research than actually getting results overnight. The same happened with the Soviet Union. Stalin was given Rolls-Royce engines by the UK. Otherwise, the Soviet aircraft industry wouldn't have gotten to the level post-war where it got. So, in a similar way, since we are also looking for transfer of technology today, but see, back then, those great powers realized that transfer of technology was something that didn't really help their long-term goals.
Hmm.
Transferring technology to their allies. I mean, what stops today's great powers who have this technology from seeing us in the same light and not repeating the mistake that they made post war? So I don't think transfer of technology is something that we should count on. But well, this is the world we live in. Those who had the opportunity exploited it when they had it, and today a lot of doors are closed for us. But I'll also like to mention that I think the Kaveri engine project was something that suffered a lot because in the 90s, when it was when it really had the steam, no? The US had sanctions on us, and it wasn't possible for us to test those engines and actually realize their potential as finished products. So I think that gap in the 90s was something that was devastating for the project. And after that, the Tejas project and the organizations around it, accepted that, yeah, we're going to have to import engines. And only very recently, when the Tejas actually made its first flight and actually got inducted into the Indian Air Force, people started asking questions. Hey, why are we relying on such a key component for such a key component on our allies, which is now ironically the United States itself?
Right. So yeah, thanks, Aditya. Like lots of things to unfold on that. But let me begin by saying that I think the Indian defense R&D scene needs two important mindset changes. Okay, it's like you said, it's not so much about various other things, but it is about in the way we do things. So my one submission, a humble submission, is that see, any government can intervene in three ways. Okay, one, it can produce, it can finance, or it can regulate, right? So in an abstract manner, these are only the three instruments that governments have for anything that they want to do, right? So either they have an agency which does the production, finance it to someone, give money to someone. Third is to regulate companies for getting a particular outcome that you want. Now, I think in the Indian defense R&D space, there is too much focus on production. Okay, and so the mindset changes that we need to move from thinking production to financing. Okay, so that means that it's okay for a non-Indian company or a non-government company to do a lot of R&D. It is okay for a startup to do that. It is okay for even an Indian company which has FDI from a foreign agency to do cutting edge R&D. The government's role should be to finance, because once you get government to produce something, and that's a normal government agency whose incentives and the people's incentives are very different than what you would have in a startup which is outside the government, then you will always have the same problems that you will have a setup which is trying to maximize on taking less risks, which is going to move towards incrementalism, which is going to move towards shorter targets and not look at moonshot ideas. So I think if you need those moonshot ideas to come through, we need to think now, move beyond production and think about financing. So can the government have an agency which finances the best ideas in India, wherever they are, whether it's in the academia, within the government, or in private sector? So that's one mindset change. The second mindset change, I think, is that we should not necessarily think about 100% indigenization, and that's where I differ from what you mentioned. The current supply chains are way too complex. There is no way we can prevent cross-border movement of intermediate goods or talent or even intellectual property. So even if we are going to aim for that, then we are thinking about a completely changed industry with instruments of the old industrial policies, and we discussed about this in a previous episode as well. So what we should be thinking of is, how can we make India a lucrative place for the best professors across the world to come and stay here, to become a part of our universities? Can the government reduce the restrictions that currently we have on people coming from abroad and working in the high tech sector? Can the government reduce restrictions on university professors coming at any level, right? Maybe associate professor, assistant professors, etc. So if we can do that, then we are going to allow talent to move in, which can spur further innovation. So that is, I think, two main mindset changes I think that we shouldn't forget.
Yeah, Pranay, I absolutely agree. And I especially agree on the part that you can't really stop globalization and integrated nature of the complex supply chains for just about every sector, including defense and the R&D that's inherent to it. So how about the role of private enterprise? So DAPA has no reservations involving private contractors and consultants, but India has only started meaningfully involving the private sector recently. So is there any specific proverbial low-hanging fruit that the Indian government can address in defense R&D?
Yeah, so it's a great point that we should discuss about private R&D, right? Because whenever we think of this sector, we have this mindset that all research happens by government funding, right? But that's not the case. So for example, private player R&D spend, I think global trends, if you see, it is somewhere around 2% of GDP in the Western world, so OECD number. And a lot of it, 1.5% of it, for example, comes from private players, not from the government. So all governments combined only account for 0.5%. So you can say private player R&D spend is 3x that of governments. And this is all in Western countries, which will have big governments and more resources with the governments as well, right? So it is really, really important for the private players to have a great R&D setup, and for the government to encourage that. So I don't think that there is any low hanging fruit here. The only thing I think governments can do in this is, one, understand that a lot of innovation happens cross border, so enable our companies to have joint partnerships to allow cross licensing, to improve our patent systems, intellectual property systems, so that Indian companies feel confident enough to develop their own intellectual property, file for intellectual property protection across the world, improve the trust in terms of the legal system that we have, so that if there is any patent infringement of products which is happening in India, the government will stand behind those whose patents are getting infringed, right? So those are the things that the government needs to do. So the locus of the solution is not within defense per se. It is a lot about our legal system, about our intellectual property system. That will spur more private player R&D, because you would have also come across this common grouse, right? People in the government will say, "Arey, our private players never spend money on R&D, and that's why government has to spend." But go and ask them, why do the private players don't spend on R&D, right? And you will see that there are so many complications to doing a lot of R&D work, that why would a company do that and instead just look at short term gain. So that is an important point. The second thing I would like to add is, there is a lot of research which recently has said that, the amount of money and the amount of resources, human talent that you need to put for any incremental advancement in technology, that has disproportionately been growing in across sectors. So this is a great study. I think we can link it in the show notes. And they have done an economic analysis of agriculture, semiconductors, many other sectors, and they have found this common trend that the amount of money and human talent that you need to put for one incremental level of advancement is grown disproportionately over the years. So research has just got a lot tougher, which means governments by no means can by themselves take the burden of doing a lot of R&D. You will need private players to pitch in, and that's where the government needs to make it smoother for them to invest in their own R&D.
Indeed, but the trends of the private sector currently, as far as I can see, has been about manufacturing and tying up with US giants and other Western countries giants like Saab, Lockheed Martin of the US, in the hopes that they would bag a tender for capital equipment supply to the Indian Armed Forces. So I think, there should be a shift in the way private business thinks, as well as the system that actually helps the private business grow. You're right that the caveats are quite wide, from concerns about legal matters to the policy about foreign imports and exports. So I agree on that. So moving forward, are there some important sectors from an Indian national perspective or Quad perspective that we should be addressing? Do any of them suggest a model for an internal defense research agency?
Yeah. So I think, this is a really important question, because it ties into what you were mentioning about transfer or technology barriers, right? I think that transfer of technology mindset, which the US had and many other countries had with regards to India, is changing. And again, I would say it is changing because of China being the major challenger to the US, right? And that's how the US imagination is, and that's why you see a lot of things happening on the Quad front as well. So, like you would have read, the Quad also has set up a working group on critical and emerging technologies. So that is, I think, a really good starting point where India and the other three countries in the Quad can look to use their own comparative advantages and think of building newer ecosystems, combined ecosystems to match and to be the most advanced in the world. So I think that is really important, and India should drive towards building more trust between these four countries. And it is important for the US also to think differently, and I think they are thinking differently. That's why you have the working group put in the first place. So that I think is one important angle. And there are some sectors which maybe the four countries can try. Like you have also co-authored a paper on rare earth supply chains. There's a lot of research that needs to be done on that count as well. So then there is also composite semiconductor research, composite materials, a lot of things on the next generation of network communication. So and there are enough different comparative advantages amongst these four countries such that they can come together and think of building one ecosystem instead of all four thinking of building something on their own. And why I say quad is just because there is a political will, there is an alignment that they need to do something in order to match the things that China has done, or even surpass that on many counts. So that I think is a important angle which can drive Quad towards taking some big bets and investing in something which is very different. So I have argued for consortiums for semiconductor fabs, for example, between the Quad countries. Think of making 65 nanometer fabs in India. Maybe you will have 2 nanometer fabs and 5 nanometer fabs in US in due course. But you can have a diversified ecosystem within the Quad instead of thinking India having its own complete ecosystem, US having its own, so on and so forth. Right. So that is, I think, important. We should think of strategic autonomy and not tactical autonomy. If all four countries think in terms of, if I give a little bit more to a Quad country, then they will become more powerful, is just thinking tactically. Because if the strategic adversary is some other country, then it is important for these four countries probably to help each other out in building a new ecosystem that can challenge your common adversary. So that's where I would put it. 2-3 areas that I can think of is, semiconductor research, is one area just to begin with, and rare earths research. A lot of metallurgical work needs to be done there as well.
True. I agree on all fronts. So key areas such as rare earth elements, supply chains, semiconductors is something that we should prioritize above all. And towards the end of this episode, I think we owe it to our readers that we should recommend some literature, and we've already made some recommendations, and we'll include it in the episode's notes. So, are there any notable recent literature pieces that we can refer to understand this issue better?
Yeah, so I think I would just think of looking at high tech geopolitics very broadly. And I think there is David Edgerton at King's College, and he's done a lot of work on the history of technology. He writes about how these techno nationalist fantasies won't be working. So I would recommend his book, Shock of the Old, I think it is, and a bunch of other writings that he does is really interesting from this perspective. Any readings you have in mind?
So, a recent paper by Maria Favrov at King's College London Center for Science and Security Studies. It's called Weapons of Mass Distortion, and it has a bunch of frameworks about emerging technologies and conflict risks. So, I think it's worth checking out for our listeners. And we'll link all of these in the description and a few additional ones. So, we'll wrap it up, folks. This has been Aditya and Pranay to All Things Policy. Do check in our previous and future episodes of All Things Policy.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, CET, Cred, and Global Victoria. We thank you so much for making all of this possible. So this week on Cyrus Says, Tapsi Pannu was recently featured in the Netflix original Haseen Dilruba was on. They discussed her experiences in Bollywood and a whole lot more. On Begin the Journey, Ashish Vidyarthi enlightens us with his wisdom on how one can get freedom from their own thoughts or insecurities when they communicate with others. On The Millennial Athlete, Tanvi and Shlok fill us in on all the drama from the world of sports with Wimbledon, Euros, and World Test cricket making headlines every day. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav Momoria kicks off a new series, Beneath the Veneer. We travel to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, where he takes us through his first experience of encountering the Red Sea. We have a brand new show, Misconduct. It's a true crime show hosted by Raghvi, a lawyer, and Nisha, a PR pro. They tell us about the story of Cyanide Malika, the lady who offered cyanide-laden sweets to women and after they died, loot their gold. On the Global Victoria Tech Talks podcast, we showcase some compelling new tech stories coming out of Melbourne. On one episode, Pawan Srinath speaks to Joe Agan from Nelnet International, where they discuss how the pandemic has affected the edtech sector and its evolution. Another episode has Varun Dugirala talking to Ross Simons from Big Ant Studios about the gaming ecosystem and how they envision translating a sport to a game. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
We live in an age of disruption, of immense change in every aspect of work, life, and business. But is the old way of doing things truly dead? And are we ever going to stop saying the new normal? Join me, Varun Dugirala, on Advertising is Dead every Tuesday as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, creators, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond to dig a little deeper into how we got here, what we're doing now, and where we're headed. You can catch all the episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.